What was life really like in the ages before modern conveniences, before antibiotics, before even basic sanitation? Forget the romanticised tales of knights and castles for a moment. The truth of the medieval world, both in Europe and across the vast diverse lands that would one day be called America, was one of constant struggle and profound challenges. For the vast majority of people living in medieval Europe, existence was inextricably tied to the land and dictated by the rigid hierarchy of the feudal system. Peasants, or serfs, were born into a life of arduous labour, their days defined by the rhythm of the seasons, and their destinies bound to the lord of the manor. They toiled from dawn till dusk, year-round, planting and harvesting crops, raising livestock and maintaining the infrastructure, all while surrendering a significant portion of their meagre yield to their overlords. Their diets were often monotonous and barely sufficient, making them acutely vulnerable to the slightest disruption in harvests. Beyond the back-breaking labour, medieval Europeans lived in a world where disease was an ever-present, terrifying spectre. Without understanding germ theory or effective medicine, outbreaks of illnesses like tuberculosis, dysentery and influenza were common, frequently sweeping through communities with devastating effect. The most infamous, of course, was the Black Death in the mid-14th century, a pandemic that wiped out an estimated 30% to 50% of Europe's population, fundamentally reshaping society and leaving an indelible mark of fear and loss. Life expectancy was shockingly low, with many not surviving past childhood, and even those who did faced a gauntlet of pain and suffering from chronic ailments and injuries that, by today's standards, would be easily treated. Across the Atlantic, in what we now call North America, a different tapestry of life unfolded during the same period. This was not an empty wilderness, but a continent vibrant with hundreds of distinct indigenous nations and cultures, each with its own complex social structures, spiritual beliefs, and sophisticated ways of living in harmony with their environments. From the agricultural societies of the Mississippian cultures, who built massive earth mounds and sustained large populations through advanced farming techniques, to the nomadic hunter-gatherers of the Great Plains and the sophisticated fishing communities of the Pacific Northwest, these societies had adapted ingeniously to their diverse landscapes. They developed intricate systems for resource management, often practicing sustainable agriculture, sophisticated hunting methods, and extensive trade networks that spanned vast distances. Yet, their lives were far from idyllic. Indigenous peoples also faced their own formidable challenges imposed by nature. Droughts could devastate crops, harsh winters could lead to scarcity, and the unpredictable forces of nature, like floods or wildfires, posed constant threats to survival. Intertribal conflicts, often driven by competition for resources, territorial disputes or honour, were also a reality, though their scale and nature often differed significantly from the large-scale, politically driven wars seen in Europe. While they experienced diseases, these were generally endemic illnesses that their populations had developed some level of immunity to over generations, not the explosive alien contagions that were yet to arrive. In essence, both worlds were defined by a profound struggle for existence, but the nature of that struggle, the threats faced, and the means of survival were fundamentally unique to each continent. Delving deeper into the daily realities of medieval Europe reveals a life of stark deprivation and constant vulnerability, particularly for the vast majority who belonged to the peasant class. Their existence was defined by relentless physical labour, beginning at dawn and often extending well past dusk, dictated entirely by the demands of agricultural cycles. Fields had to be ploughed, seeds sown by hand, and harvests painstakingly gathered, often using rudimentary tools that demanded immense physical exertion. This was not merely work, it was a fundamental struggle for survival. Beyond the sheer toil, peasants were inextricably bound to the land and their lord, a condition known as serfdom. They lacked the freedom to leave, marry, or even make significant personal decisions without the lord's permission, effectively living as property attached to the estate. Their meagre dwellings, often simple, one-room hovels shared with livestock, offered little comfort or protection from the elements, and sanitation was virtually non-existent, creating a fertile breeding ground for disease. The threat of famine loomed perpetually. A single, bad harvest, caused by unpredictable weather, a prolonged drought, excessive rain, or an early frost could condemn entire communities to starvation. Food stores were minimal, and without modern preservation techniques, surplus was difficult to maintain. Diets were typically limited to grains, some vegetables, and very rarely meat, leading to widespread malnutrition and weakened immune systems that made them even more susceptible to illness. Disease, as previously mentioned, was not just an occasional occurrence but a constant companion. Beyond the dramatic impact of the Black Death, countless other illnesses chipped away at the population. Cholera, dysentery, and influenza were endemic, often spread rapidly by poor hygiene, contaminated water sources, and crowded living conditions. Child mortality rates were extraordinarily high, with many children not surviving beyond their 5th birthday, a tragic reality that shaped family life and societal resilience. Furthermore, the political landscape of medieval Europe was rarely stable. Constant localized conflicts between rival lords, banditry, and larger-scale wars between kingdoms meant that even if a peasant survived the harvest and avoided disease, their home and livelihood could be destroyed by marauding armies or raiding parties, forcing them to flee or face violence. This multifaceted struggle against nature, against oppressive social structures, and against the violence of their times made the life of the medieval European peasant a relentless gauntlet of hardship and uncertainty. Turning our gaze to the vast and diverse lands of North America before the arrival of Europeans reveals a tapestry of human experience equally shaped by the environment, yet distinct in its challenges and the ingenious solutions developed to meet them. Hundreds of independent indigenous nations thrived across the continent, each with unique cultures, languages, social structures, and profound spiritual connections to their ancestral lands. Life for these peoples was not a utopian ideal, but a dynamic engagement with their environment, requiring immense adaptability and knowledge. From the intricate irrigation systems developed by the Pueblo peoples in the arid southwest, to sustain their corn, bean, and squash agriculture, to the sophisticated hunting techniques of the Plains tribes, who followed the vast buffalo herds, and the rich marine cultures of the Pacific Northwest, who harvested the bounty of the ocean and forests. These societies demonstrated remarkable ingenuity. They possessed an intimate understanding of their ecosystems, developing sustainable practices that ensured the long-term viability of their food sources and natural resources, living not just on the land but with it. However, despite their deep environmental knowledge and resilient societies, indigenous peoples faced their own formidable natural and social challenges. The forces of nature, unpredictable and powerful, could devastate communities. Prolonged droughts could lead to widespread crop failures for agricultural societies, while severe winters might decimate game populations for hunter-gatherers, pushing communities to the brink of starvation. Natural disasters such as floods, wildfires, or volcanic eruptions, though less frequent, also posed existential threats, capable of displacing entire populations and destroying their means of subsistence. Furthermore, intertribal conflicts were a real, though often localized aspect of life. These disputes could arise over competition for prime hunting grounds, access to vital resources like water or obsidian, or in response to grievances and acts of aggression. While these conflicts generally differed in scale and objectives from the large-scale territorial wars of European kingdoms, they still resulted in casualties, displacement, and periods of insecurity for affected communities. Diseases also existed within these populations, such as various forms of tuberculosis or gastrointestinal illnesses. However, these were typically endemic diseases that the populations had co-evolved with over millennia, developing a degree of natural immunity or traditional medicinal practices to manage them, a crucial distinction that would become devastatingly apparent with the arrival of entirely foreign pathogens. Thus, indigenous life before contact was a testament to human resilience and adaptation in the face of nature's power and the complexities of intercommunity relations. The moment European sails appeared on the horizon, whether in the Caribbean, along the eastern seaboard, or later pushing inland, marked an irreversible and utterly catastrophic turning point for the indigenous peoples of the Americas. This was not merely the arrival of new people with different technologies. It was the unwitting introduction of a silent, invisible enemy against which native populations had absolutely no defense. Europeans carried with them a devastating arsenal of old world diseases that had been circulating in Afro-Eurasia for centuries. Diseases like smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, cholera, and bubonic plague. For generations, Europeans and Africans had developed some degree of natural immunity to these pathogens through continuous exposure, a concept entirely foreign to the Americas. Indigenous populations, isolated for thousands of years, had no prior exposure, and thus no antibodies, no genetic resistance, and no collective memory of how to combat these alien contagions. The impact was immediate and horrific. Smallpox, in particular, was an exceptionally virulent killer, often spreading far ahead of actual European explorers or settlers, decimating entire villages and nations before direct contact was even made. Survivors described the terrifying symptoms: high fever, agonizing body aches, and pustules that covered the entire body, often leading to blindness, disfigurement, or death. Entire communities were wiped out, sometimes 90% or more of their inhabitants succumbing to the disease. Villages that had once bustled with life fell silent, their fields lying fallow, their social structures collapsing as leaders, healers, and entire family lines vanished. It was an apocalyptic scenario on a continental scale, far surpassing the death tolls of even the Black Death in Europe, simply because the population had no prior exposure or defence. This demographic catastrophe fundamentally weakened indigenous societies, making them far more vulnerable to the subsequent waves of European conquest, enslavement, and forced displacement. The loss of elders meant the loss of invaluable knowledge, oral histories, agricultural techniques, spiritual traditions, and medicinal practices, leaving survivors reeling and struggling to rebuild amidst unimaginable grief and a decimated social fabric. This biological warfare, though often unintentional on the part of the Europeans, remains one of the most tragic and impactful aspects of the transatlantic encounter, far overshadowing any other form of hardship previously experienced by indigenous peoples. With indigenous populations reeling from the biological onslaught, the stage was tragically set for the next, equally devastating phase of the European arrival: direct conquest and systematic exploitation. European powers, driven by a thirst for land, resources, and imperial glory, quickly transitioned from exploration to aggressive colonization. The concept of terra nullius, or empty land, was often invoked to justify their territorial ambitions, completely disregarding the established presence and sovereignty of indigenous nations. This mentality fueled a relentless push westward, leading to an endless series of wars and massacres that were fundamentally different from the intertribal conflicts indigenous peoples had known. These were not disputes over hunting grounds, but existential battles for survival against technologically superior forces armed with gunpowder, steel weapons, and a ruthless strategic mindset aimed at domination. The violence was often brutal and disproportionate, with countless communities annihilated and their people slaughtered. Beyond outright warfare, the Europeans introduced insidious tactics of forced displacement. Indigenous nations were systematically removed from their ancestral lands, often at gunpoint, and pushed into increasingly smaller, less fertile territories, disrupting their traditional economies, social structures, and spiritual ties to the land. This displacement was not just a loss of property, it was a profound act of cultural violence, severing generations of connection to specific places that held immense historical and religious significance. Moreover, the insatiable demand for labour, particularly in the burgeoning plantation economies and rich silver mines, led directly to the widespread enslavement of indigenous peoples. Men, women, and children were captured, brutalised, and forced into back-breaking labour under horrific conditions, often dying from exhaustion, malnutrition, or disease. While the transatlantic slave trade later brought millions of Africans to the Americas, the enslavement of Native Americans was a significant, though often overlooked, aspect of early colonial exploitation, further decimating populations and tearing apart their societies. This systematic oppression and violence, driven by colonial ambition and a deeply ingrained sense of racial superiority, added layers of unimaginable suffering on top of the demographic collapse caused by disease, marking a period of profound and deliberate destruction for indigenous civilizations across the continent. The cumulative effect of disease, conquest, and enslavement created a fundamental and unequal burden that definitively separates the hardships faced by medieval Europeans from the existential crisis endured by indigenous peoples in the Americas. While Europe certainly navigated its own periods of immense suffering, the Black Death being a prime example, its societies, though battered, ultimately recovered and adapted. The population rebound, the renegotiation of labour relations post-plague, and the eventual blossoming of new intellectual and economic eras demonstrated a resilience that, while hard-won, allowed European civilization to not only persist, but to expand and flourish. Indeed, much of Europe's subsequent prosperity and global dominance were tragically built upon the very exploitation and resources extracted from the colonized lands and peoples. Their challenges, however dire, rarely threatened the total annihilation of their entire cultural and demographic fabric. For indigenous nations, the arrival of Europeans marked not just hardship, but a multi-generational catastrophe that pushed many to the brink of complete demographic and cultural collapse. The scale of death from introduced diseases was unparalleled in human history, wiping out entire language groups, spiritual traditions, and intricate social networks in a matter of decades. Unlike Europe, which could draw upon its own internal recovery mechanisms and external conquests, indigenous communities faced a relentless external force intent on their subjugation and dispossession. Their lands were stolen, their spiritual sites desecrated, their traditional economies shattered, and their governance structures dismantled. The very notion of discovery that permeated European narratives conveniently erased millennia of indigenous habitation and sophisticated societal development, reframing the invasion as a benevolent act. This was not a reciprocal exchange of cultures, but a brutal imposition of one worldview over countless others, often backed by overwhelming force. The difference in impact is stark. For Europeans, the medieval period eventually gave way to rebirth and expansion. For indigenous peoples, contact initiated a prolonged period of systematic oppression, cultural genocide, and profound loss from which many nations are still striving to fully recover. The burden was and remains profoundly unequal. As we draw this comparison to a close, it becomes powerfully clear that while hardship was an undeniable constant in both medieval Europe and pre-contact indigenous America, the very nature and scale of suffering shifted dramatically with the arrival of Europeans. We've seen that medieval Europeans faced grinding poverty, relentless labour, devastating plagues like the Black Death, and the constant threat of famine and war. Their lives were undoubtedly arduous, a testament to human endurance in the face of brutal environmental and social realities. Yet, their civilization, though challenged, endured and eventually evolved, benefiting from a foundational resilience and a trajectory that, crucially, did not involve the wholesale decimation and systematic subjugation by an external force. In stark contrast, the hardships faced by indigenous peoples after European contact were of a fundamentally different order, an existential assault that dwarfed any prior challenges. The introduction of old world diseases, against which they had no immunity, unleashed a biological holocaust, wiping out millions and shattering countless societies. This was swiftly followed by relentless conquest, forced displacement, and brutal enslavement, driven by colonial ambition and a chilling disregard for indigenous sovereignty and humanity. Their lands were stolen, their cultures suppressed, and their populations decimated, leading to a profound and enduring intergenerational trauma that continues to resonate today. The European narrative of discovery often glosses over this brutal reality, sanitizing a history of invasion and genocide. Understanding this profound disparity isn't about diminishing the struggles of medieval Europeans, but about accurately recognizing the unparalleled catastrophe that befell indigenous peoples. It's about confronting the uncomfortable truths of history and acknowledging that for one group, hardship was a part of life's struggle, while for the other, it became an active, systemic campaign of annihilation and dispossession. This historical understanding is not merely academic, it's vital for recognizing the ongoing challenges faced by indigenous communities and fostering a more just and equitable future.